Welcome back to Pod Talk, the podcast about other podcasts. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm your host, Becky Holland. And if you haven't listened to my first episode, I hope you'll go back and check it out. On today's episode, I'm sharing with you two podcasts that have profoundly shaped who I am and how I see the world. And yes, you could probably say that what I'm describing is the very definition of woke. But honestly, through the powerful stories I'll be recommending today, I feel like I've had a genuine awakening and am seeing the world for what it is, about our country, our history, and the realities so many people live every day. So yep, woke. But in all seriousness, these podcast stories have influenced the way I see and understand the world around me, shaped my role as an educator, deepened my perspective on history and the Black experience, and challenged how I think about the treatment of people, especially those of color and those from differing socioeconomic backgrounds. Simply put, these podcasts have changed me, and I can't wait to share them with you. When I think back on my own upbringing, I recognize it's from a place of privilege. Growing up as a white girl in New England, I can't say that I thought much about racism. At the elite private school I attended, there was some diversity, and perhaps more than at the public schools, but it was still limited, to say the least. And when I think back to what we were taught, the Black experience was reduced to a narrow storyline. Slavery, the Civil War, the Bill of Rights, the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks. And that was about it. The word racism itself was hardly ever spoken, and if it was carried with it a sense of shame or inappropriateness. I had never heard of things like redlining, police violence, brutality, the school to prison pipeline, or segregation in education and housing, currently, just a few of the many visible realities of systemic racism. Now, today, as a middle school teacher, I want to do so much better for my students. So in my classroom, we say the word, we name it. We read about it, write about it, talk about it, and create space for anyone who wants to share their perspective. And for what it's worth, I'm still learning and still working every day. The two podcasts I'm about to share have been an important part of that journey. They've educated me, no doubt, challenged me, and inspired me. And I'm deeply grateful to the creators and participants who had the courage to share their stories. So with that gratitude in mind, I want to share with you the podcast that I highly recommend today, Floodlines and the Africas versus America. So first up is Floodlines. And this recommendation feels especially timely, as this past August 29th marked the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, the backdrop for this powerful story. At first, you might expect this to be just another account of the storm, but it's so much more than that. Floodlines isn't simply about Hurricane Katrina. At its core, it's about systemic racism and the devastating impact the disaster had on Black New Orleanians. Listening to this podcast opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect and left me both heartbroken and more aware of how disasters, both natural or otherwise, rarely affect communities equally. So before I get into the story itself, I have to share with you a little bit about the host. If you've listened to Pod Talk before, you know I can't really recommend a show unless I love the host. And no surprise here, Van Newkirk II is incredible. His voice is as rich and deep as New Orleans pride and steady like the Gulf waters. I know, a little cheesy, or a lot. But honestly, you'll be completely enthralled with his storytelling prowess and unforgettable voice. I promise. Also worth noting, Van brings serious credibility. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic, where he reports on race, politics, history, and environmental issues. And because of his personal ties to the Gulf Coast, his connections to this story run deep, which you can really feel throughout the series. Okay, so now you know, this story isn't just about the physical destruction caused by the hurricane. It's about the catastrophic impact of systemic racism that exists in our country. It's about how New Orleans was shaped by structural racism, where neighborhoods were built, how levees were placed and neglected, and which communities were left most vulnerable. It's about unimaginable failures of emergency response efforts at every level, city, state, and national. It's about despicable and inhumane conditions in places that were supposed to be safe havens. It's about cultural narratives that painted citizens and survivors as looters and lawless, rather than narratives of victims and human beings. It's about the militarized policing of people who had already lost everything. And it's about the gaslighting at the highest levels of government, FEMA and beyond. So there you have it. And if you're like me, you probably remember watching the so-called events of Katrina unfold on TV and safely from a distance, at home, far from both storms, the storm of systemic racism and the hurricane itself. But you knew that already. So please go and listen to Floodlines. For my second recommendation today, one that I think flies under the radar but deserves so much more attention. For me, this podcast uncovered a piece of American history I had never, ever heard of, much less learned about, and I'm guessing maybe it's new to you, or maybe you've heard of it but don't really know, all the events surrounding it. Or maybe you know a lot about this, but this podcast will still blow your mind. So the event it explores are shocking, eye-opening, and unforgettable, I promise. The Africas versus America, hosted by Matt Amha, tells the story of a Black family labeled as quote-unquote radicals who founded a group called MOVE. And the way that they write their name is in all caps. MOVE. Their existence ultimately became so threatening to the city of Philadelphia that it led to a catastrophic and deadly clash, a moment that laid bare the power and reach of systemic racism. And so I don't give away too much. I'm not going to share the how, but I'm going to share the whys. To call this story complicated is an understatement. It's layered, messy, and unsettling. The podcast begins with a revelation shocking enough on its own, that the remains of a MOVE family member were being kept and used for research in the Penn Museum, a museum that is in Philadelphia and is funded and operated by the University of Pennsylvania without the knowledge or consent of their family. From there, we meet MOVE members and descendants who are being asked to reclaim family relatives believed to have already been laid to rest, forcing them again to relive history full of pain and injustice. So MOVE was a group founded in 1972 by a man named Vincent Leapart, who renamed himself John Africa, a symbolic gesture honoring his African roots while rejecting his colonial given birth name. In solidarity, all MOVE members adopted the surname Africa, a unifying act that bound the group together like family. MOVE members grounded their beliefs in environmentalism, activism, and a back-to-nature lifestyle that emphasized communal living and a rejection of many mainstream norms. At the core, they saw themselves as a peaceful, life-centered group. It's also worth noting that after a major conflict with MOVE and the Philadelphia police in 1978, MOVE members relocated their home to Osage Avenue. And I just think, is there a greater irony than the fact that their new home stood on a street named after people who were also ruthlessly persecuted and nearly erased from history? Just is astounding. Okay. So while MOVE was a peaceful, life-centered group in their belief systems, their activism in the 1970s in Philadelphia was anything but quiet. MOVE organized loud, relentless demonstrations in protest of issues such as racism, animal rights, and social injustices, which often led to frequent conflicts with neighbors and the Philadelphia police. Over time, MOVE's confrontational style with authorities and others only heightened the city's existing tensions, and the group came to be seen as radical and disruptive, garnering national attention. Ultimately, the conflicts reached a tipping point, fueled by the notoriously aggressive and openly racist leadership of Mayor Frank Rizzo, and culminated in unimaginable tragedy. So go listen to the Africas versus America. I highly recommend it. So, those are my two podcasts that I am sharing with you today. For more information about Pod Talk, you can email me at apodtalk, apodtok, at gmail.com, or follow our social on Instagram, pod.talk. And if you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and a 5-star review, as it helps us get discovered. And of course, be sure to share this podcast and the ones I'm recommending with friends, family, coworkers, and anyone who loves a great podcast series. Thanks so much for listening today. And until next time, have a good one.